Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We begin now with Story 1, The Silent Bells of Messina. Introduction, a morning like any other. It was early October in the year 1347. The Sicilian port city of Messina, nestled in the crook between Italy and the island's northeastern shores, bustled with its usual rhythm. Merchants shouted through the briny morning air, unloading crates of spices, wool, and glass from incoming Genoese ships. Fishermen mended nets along the piers while the tolling of church bells punctuated the hum of commerce. Unbeknownst to the city, death had arrived in its harbor. The ships from Genoa, 12 in total, were returning not from some distant European city, but from the east. Some had recently docked in Constantinople, others traced a longer arc from the ports of the Black Sea. Most significantly, they had passed through Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, a port city on the Crimean Peninsula, and the last known stop before the long sail home. There, a siege by Mongol forces had led to a strange, horrifying act: corpses hurled over city walls by trebuchet. The defenders, Genoese merchants, fled by sea. They did not know they carried the disease with them. Within days, the bells in Messina stopped ringing for mass. The first symptoms. The disease worked quickly. The sailors who disembarked were sick, visibly so. Their bodies bore dark swellings, especially in the groin and armpits, buboes, black and angry beneath the skin. Fever followed, and within 2 or 3 days many died. The city physicians, accustomed to ailments like gout or fever from poor water, were baffled. Bloodletting, the ever-reliable remedy, was applied. Prayers were offered. Nothing worked. Even those who had not boarded the ship soon fell ill. Laborers who handled cargo, dock officials, curious townspeople who had come to see the returning fleet. Death seemed to pass without touch, without reason. By the end of the first week, bodies were left on doorsteps. The clergy and their silence. The monasteries initially opened their doors to the sick. Friars and monks, believing care for the dying to be their Christian duty, moved among the infected with solemn devotion. But the deaths continued, and then they too began to die, one by one, silently. The bells that had once marked morning mass, vespers, and funeral rites grew still. There were too few priests left to ring them. Funerals became communal ditches. The dead, no longer named, were shoveled under hastily in mass pits outside the city walls. Sacred rites were whispered by laymen, in some cases not at all. With the loss of clergy, Messina lost a central pillar of daily life. The spiritual cadence of the city, the repeated rituals that ordered its days, ceased. Daily life in disarray. The market stalls began to empty, not from a lack of goods, though trade had certainly slowed, but because there were fewer people to sell and fewer still to buy. Those who could afford it left the city for the hills. Entire households abandoned mansions and villas. Their servants fled, too, and sometimes returned only to plunder. Others stayed, out of obligation, or fear, or poverty, but daily rhythms shifted. Bread was no longer delivered. Children wandered the streets unsupervised. Livestock roamed where carts once moved. Rats, long inhabitants of the city's crevices, now ran free with eerie boldness. Some families locked themselves indoors, convinced the air itself was poisoned. They hung herbs in windows and burned aromatic wood, but the plague found its way in anyway. A network of death. Messina was a gateway. Goods from the east moved through its harbor toward Naples, Florence, Marseille, And with those goods came the contagion. Overland travelers carried it inland. Fleeing nobles, unaware of their own infection, brought it to their country estates. And still, ships continued to dock, despite warnings, despite rising fears. The port authorities attempted closures too late. The city gates were manned. Visitors were denied entry, but the disease was already within. By late October, other cities began reporting similar outbreaks. Catania, Palermo. By December, it had reached Genoa and Pisa, then farther north to Venice and Marseille. A silent invasion, no conqueror, no warhorse, only breath and rot. The mystery of the plague. To the people of Messina, the cause of the plague was unclear. The miasma theory, bad air, was the prevailing belief. Astrologers pointed to an unfavorable alignment of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in March of 1345. Others believed it a punishment from God, a divine scourge sent for mankind's sins. Still others whispered darker explanations: Jews poisoning wells, heretics angering heaven, foreigners bringing death in their footsteps. But in truth, the real cause, a bacterium spread by fleas on black rats, was unknown. And thus, without knowledge, there was no weapon, no cure, no defense. Quiet resistance. Despite the panic, some semblance of resistance emerged, not through medicine, but adaptation. Midwives took over duties normally performed by physicians. The dying were tended to not by clerics, but by neighbors. People began keeping written records of those lost, a desperate attempt to give names to the faceless dead. City councils began to consider more permanent measures: restrictions on movement, temporary burial grounds, the earliest glimmers of quarantine. Still, Messina had changed. The city was no longer a beacon of trade and wealth. It was a place whispered about in fear, a site of death. The story of Messina is not only the beginning of the Black Death in Europe, but also the beginning of countless threads of human loss, resilience, and confusion in the face of the unknown. Its bells, now silenced, once called a thriving city to worship, to trade, to life. Now they toll only in memory. But what happened next, when Messina's infection spread across the Mediterranean, would shape the fate of entire kingdoms? What did the city's demise teach the world? And who, if anyone, would listen? In the weeks following Messina's infection, ships continued to sail, some fully manned, others drifting, crewed only by the dead. Harbors along the Tyrrhenian Sea began turning away vessels from Sicily and Genoa, but communication was slow, and disease even faster. Few understood what they were facing, and fewer still had the authority or courage to stop the flow of goods and people. In one account, a galley from Messina docked in Marseille without warning. Its crew, though visibly ill, were allowed ashore. Within days, the same telltale signs appeared: fever, swellings, sudden death. Within weeks, bodies lay unburied in the streets. Marseille, once vibrant with commerce and culture, entered its darkest days. From Messina to the Adriatic, from Provence to the Peloponnesus, the echoes of that first outbreak rippled out in silence. Trade networks as arteries of plague. The 14th century Mediterranean was a deeply interconnected world. Maritime republics like Genoa and Venice had established lucrative routes spanning from Constantinople to North Africa. These connections, built over generations, meant that goods, silk, wool, spices, and grain moved swiftly between ports. So too did disease. When Messina fell to the plague, its sickness rode aboard these ships, reaching Naples, then to Rome. Florence saw its first cases by early 1348. From there, it spread north into the heart of Europe and west into the Iberian Peninsula. Every city, every town connected by road or sea, became vulnerable. There was no escaping it. Those who fled did not realize they carried death with them. The human toll spreads. Messina may have been the first, but it was not the last to suffer catastrophe. In each new city, the pattern repeated. First, a ship or caravan arrives. Then, illness appears in the port quarters or merchant districts. Next, local authorities too late attempt to seal off neighborhoods or halt trade. Finally, panic sets in as clergy, nobility, physicians, and servants alike begin to die. In Pisa, entire blocks of housing were abandoned. In Avignon, the seat of the papacy, death came so swiftly that the Pope himself was surrounded by fire to ward off the bad air. And in Florence, one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, the death toll would reach over half the population. But still, people clung to their work. Bakers continued baking. Gravediggers, when they could be found, dug faster. Records were kept by notaries who knew their names would be the last written down. The persistence of ordinary life, in the face of extraordinary death, became one of the plague's most human legacies. The failed quarantines. The idea of quarantine 40 giorni, or 40 days, had not yet been formalized, but rudimentary forms of isolation began to emerge in the wake of Messina's outbreak. In Venice, city leaders began turning away ships from infected ports. Some vessels were ordered to remain at sea for periods of time. In Milan, homes where plague had been found were sealed with the sick and healthy alike inside. These acts, desperate and cruel, were among the earliest government attempts to manage public health. In theory, these restrictions could slow the spread. In practice, they often came too late. Messina's failure to contain its own ships had already doomed dozens of cities. Still, these early responses laid the groundwork for future public health systems. The very idea that a city could act to protect its people by restricting movement was revolutionary. Religious responses and repercussions. As the plague spread from Messina, faith was both solace and scapegoat. People turned to the church in unprecedented numbers, confessing sins, praying for divine mercy, lighting candles at shrines. Religious processions multiplied. Monasteries filled with those seeking last rites or miracles. But when priests began dying in greater numbers, confidence began to erode. In some areas, people blamed the church for failing to protect them. In others, extremist religious movements took hold. One such group, the Flagellants, marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public, crying out for God's forgiveness. They rejected church hierarchy, claimed divine authority, and warned of apocalypse. The Flagellants spread fear as well as plague, and in some cases incited violence. In Strasbourg and elsewhere, Jews were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells, a baseless accusation with deadly consequences. Entire communities were burned, expelled, or massacred. The spread of plague became not just a medical crisis, but a crisis of faith, trust, and humanity. Economic disruption and labor collapse. The Mediterranean economy in the 14th century relied heavily on both maritime trade and rural agriculture. With the death of laborers came collapse. Messina's fields like those in Provence, Tuscany, and Aragon went unharvested. Vineyards wilted. Olive trees bore fruit that rotted on the branch. In the cities, workshops closed. Apprentices died and their masters followed. But something strange happened in the economic chaos. Wages began to rise. With fewer workers available, surviving laborers could demand more. Peasants who had once lived in near servitude suddenly found themselves negotiating pay. Lords and guild masters faced shortages, and some were forced to offer contracts and freedoms previously unimaginable. The seeds of socioeconomic transformation were planted in the death-ridden fields outside cities like Messina. The fate of Messina itself. After the initial wave of plague, Messina's population had been reduced by nearly 60%. The harbor, once a hub of trade, fell into eerie silence. Foreign ships refused to dock there. The markets collapsed. For months, the city was a ghost town. And yet Messina did not die. By 1350, survivors began returning. Trade resumed, albeit slowly. Rebuilding took years and the psychological scars never truly healed, but records show city councils meeting again. Taxes were collected. New births were registered. The city's bells, so long silent, were eventually rung once more, not just in mourning, but in tentative hope. Administrative memory, lessons learned. One of the most lasting effects of the plague in Messina and beyond was the creation of administrative memory. Cities began to record disease outbreaks more systematically. Ships were required to declare their last port of call. Public health offices, rudimentary though they were, began to emerge in places like Venice and Genoa. Messina's failure had taught an unforgettable lesson. The cost of inaction was not just economic, it was existential. This painful awareness would later evolve into permanent infrastructure: plague hospitals, lazarettos, quarantine islands, and maritime law reforms. Bureaucracy, often seen as dull and rigid, became a tool of survival. A new era dawns. By the early 1350s, as the first wave of plague began to ebb, the world Messina had known was gone. Entire families had vanished. Guilds were broken. Estates passed to distant cousins or opportunistic nobility. And yet in the empty houses and overgrown fields something stirred: opportunity. The survivors, traumatized and wary, nevertheless stepped into new roles. Women inherited businesses. Peasants leased land. The social order, once solid and immovable, began to crack. The Black Death, born from the port of Messina, did more than kill. It transformed. From the quiet harbor of Messina to the bustling markets of Marseille and Florence, the Black Death used the very structures of human connection to spread. Trade, religion, family, and bureaucracy all became vectors of devastation. And yet, in their unraveling, new systems began to emerge. Messina may have fallen first, but it also offered the first glimpses of resistance, adaptation, and rebirth. Still, what of the individual lives? How did ordinary people, sailors, midwives, scribes, cope with loss and the daily rituals of survival? What stories remain, if any, of those who witnessed it firsthand? Most great events in history leave behind a record of their protagonists: kings, generals, reformers. But the Black Death, and especially its early chapter in Messina, is written mostly in silences. In mass graves without markers, in church registries that stopped mid-page, in the absence of those who might have written it down. And yet, if we peer closely enough at the fragments, at legal documents, wills, notarial rolls, and household accounts, we begin to recover the faintest outlines of lives lived and lost. Ordinary people, forgotten by name, but not by action. In their humble responses to the plague, they reveal the human face of a city under siege by death. Scribe without a church, Pietro di Castello. One such figure was Pietro di Castello, a minor scribe who worked under the church of Santa Maria degli Alemani in Messina. His job was simple: record tithes, transcribe correspondence, update burial records. For years, Pietro lived unnoticed, his name barely mentioned except on parish scrolls. In late 1347, the church archives show a sudden shift in his handwriting from smooth, steady script to hurried, uneven lines. The burial register expands dramatically. Instead of 1 or 2 deaths per day, he begins listing up to 50. Sometimes only initials are recorded. Some days are left blank entirely. Then, in early November, the entries stop. Pietro may have died, or fled, or simply stopped recording because there were too many to count. In his desperate effort to preserve names, we glimpse something quietly profound: the need to document humanity, even as it disappears. The fisherman who stayed. Along the rocky beaches near Messina's northern quarter, a man named Corrado, likely a fisherman, continued casting his nets well into December of 1347. Oral accounts, written decades later, refer to the man with the black dog, who was seen bringing in small catches each morning long after others had abandoned the harbor. He reportedly refused to leave the city, saying simply, "If the sea hasn't claimed me yet, the plague won't either." Corrado's routine, ordinary and stubborn, was not unique. In every plague-struck town, someone stayed. Someone cleaned streets. Someone watched children. Someone hauled the carts of the dead. In Corrado, we find a symbol of quiet resistance not born from hope or heroism, but from habit, poverty, or resignation. Children without names. Perhaps the most tragic losses in Messina were those of children. Many were buried without names, especially those from poorer families. Some estimates suggest that over half the city's children died within the first 4 months of the plague. One particular document, a hastily drafted will, lists a woman named Isabetta, described only as a washerwoman. Her will names 2 surviving daughters, Lucia and Marietta, aged 6 and 9, to be placed under the care of a cousin in Taormina. No record exists to confirm whether the cousin ever took them in. Elsewhere, notarial records reference the construction of an orphan chamber in 1348, funded by leftover merchant donations. It's unclear how many orphans were placed there or survived the year. The children of Messina remind us that demographic data is not abstract. Behind every statistic was a voice just beginning to speak. The silent laborers, women's work in crisis. As the plague decimated the city's male population, women, especially lower-class women, took up increasingly public roles. Midwives became caretakers for the dying. Washers and cooks managed entire households. Some acted as informal nurses, risking infection daily. In one surviving court record, a woman named Alessa de Briga sued a merchant for failing to pay her for 6 weeks of plague tending. Her claim was upheld, suggesting a degree of legal recognition for women's labor during the crisis. Though their names are rarely found in chronicles, women were the glue that held fragments of daily life together during the plague. They buried children, nursed neighbors, and took over market stalls. They worked not out of charity but necessity. In Messina, as across Europe, the plague widened the boundaries of women's public roles, if only briefly. Rituals without meaning. The bells of Messina had once called the faithful to Mass, to confession, to marriage. But as death overwhelmed the city, these rituals collapsed. Priests died, churches emptied, sacraments went unperformed. Instead, new and improvised rituals emerged. People lit fires in the streets. Hopping smoke would cleanse the air. Herbs were worn in hats or hung in homes. Some carried talismans, bones, feathers, or scraps of religious text. In a city where death had no order, even superstition became structure. Some communities created their own prayers, whispered in common houses or at doorways marked with black crosses. In this way, faith did not die, it changed, transformed by fear but not extinguished. The absence of church bells did not mean the absence of belief. It meant belief had retreated into the private, the desperate, the deeply personal. The psychological toll. Even those who survived physically bore scars that would last a lifetime. Diaries and letters written after the fact speak of a strange numbness. A merchant from Syracuse wrote, "I no longer measure the day by meals or mass, but by when I last saw someone alive." Trauma left people fragmented. Some avoided cities forever. Others refused to speak of the plague again. Children born in the years after were raised by grandparents or strangers, with no memory of parents or siblings. In many communities, laughter became taboo. Weddings were postponed for years. Music went silent, not by law but by mood. In Messina, the psychological toll lingered long after the dead were buried. Seeds of social change. And yet, even in such darkness, something stirred. With so many officials, clergy, and guild masters dead, survivors stepped into their roles. Younger sons inherited businesses. Former servants managed estates. Women took control of property and children's futures. Land once held by noble families fell into the hands of surviving commoners. Legal documents show sudden shifts in ownership, and with them, shifts in status. Wages increased. For a time, workers could negotiate. Serfs left the land for towns. Apprentices became masters sooner than expected. The rigid social pyramid that had dominated medieval life began to tilt, if not collapse. Messina had been a feudal port. It emerged from the plague something slightly different, uncertain, fluid, and strangely modern. The return of the bells. By late 1350, Messina's churches began to reassemble their clergy. Bells rang again, but less frequently. Many had cracked from neglect or been stolen during the worst months. The city was quieter, older, and poorer. But it was not dead. Families returned, houses were repaired, children were born. The port slowly resumed its traffic. Ships carried not just goods but stories of cities fallen, of towns reborn, of those who had stayed behind. In time, people stopped speaking of the plague, not because it was forgotten but because it was too large to hold in memory. It had become part of the city's bones, a silent weight beneath its streets. Messina had survived, not unchanged, but undeniably alive. End of story 1. Final reflection. The Silent Bells of Messina is more than the tale of the Black Death's entry into Europe. It is the story of how a city fell into silence and clawed its way back toward life. Its story is not told in the lives of emperors or great thinkers, but in those of scribes, midwives, children, and fishermen, in broken routines, in empty markets, in makeshift prayers. It reminds us that history is often not made in dramatic moments, but in daily acts of survival, and that sometimes the most profound resilience is simply staying when everyone else flees. Yet the question remains: if death could strike so suddenly, reshape cities, and erase generations, what lessons, if any, did the survivors truly carry forward? Story 2. A Merchant's Diary in Florence. In the spring of 1348, the city of Florence was bustling, fragrant with early roses, and thick with human ambition. Merchants haggled in the Piazza della Signoria, looms clacked in the workshops of Oltrarno, and horses clattered over the stone bridges of the Arno. Florence was a city of money. Its bankers financed kings, its wool guilds clothed popes, and its scribes recorded every transaction with careful, practiced hands. Among these scribes was Matteo di Aldobrando, a cloth merchant and minor financier in the neighborhood of Santa Croce. His daily habit was to begin with a short entry in his merchant's ledger: quantities bought, payments owed, who delivered what and when. On January 5, 1348, he wrote, "Received 30 bolts of English wool from Pisa, weather mild. Paid Bartolo 4 florins." It was a sentence indistinguishable from any other. And yet, within 3 months, Matteo's ledgers would no longer record goods, but funerals, debts forgiven, and long silences between lines. This is the story of a man who kept writing as the world changed around him, a diary of commerce turned elegy. A city at the height of its power. Before the plague, Florence was among the wealthiest cities in Europe. Its population neared 100,000, a figure rivaled only by Paris and Venice. Gold florins minted in the city bore the image of St. John the Baptist and were accepted across Europe. Wool, the city's lifeblood, was imported raw from England, spun and dyed in local workshops, and sold in the markets of Avignon, Bruges, and Constantinople. Matteo's own business was modest but respectable. He worked out of a shop just 2 streets from the Arno, assisted by 2 apprentices and his younger brother. The family had risen from peasant roots just 3 generations earlier, and Matteo took pride in maintaining his accounts with near liturgical devotion. Florence functioned like a great machine, each class and guild with its purpose, each church and piazza with its rhythm. And Matteo, like so many others, believed the gears would keep turning forever. Rumors from the south. In early February, rumors began to swirl of a sickness in Sicily, of ships turned away from Genoa, of entire towns abandoned in Corsica. Matteo noted the first mention on February 12th. Received letter from cousin Lapo in Lucca. says pestilence spreading from the south, unclear if truth or idle talk. At the time, the city remained calm. Florence was a place of politics and money, not superstition. The physicians were confident, the priests reassuring. Markets stayed open. The bells still rang. Trade continued. The plague, it seemed, was still elsewhere. And then, by March, people in Pisa began dying. By April, the first bodies in Florence were buried hastily in the outskirts of San Miniato. The plague arrives. Matteo's April entries are short, clipped. April 4, paid boy to deliver wool to Spinney brothers. Streets quiet. Rumor of priest falling ill mid-sermon. April 7, apprentice Tommaso feverish, sent him home. April 9, Tommaso dead. The days blur quickly thereafter. Matteo's once careful script becomes more erratic. Transactions are no longer about goods or shipments, but things like coffin boards, sacks of lime, and mass for Giulia. As in Messina before it, the disease spread with startling speed. Fever, vomiting, and the dreaded swellings dark as bruises, hot to the touch, appeared. People died in hours. Physicians began refusing house calls. Priests performed last rites from a distance, or not at all. Florence was no longer a city of art and finance. It became a city of fear. The end of the marketplace. By late April, the Mercato Vecchio was unrecognizable. Where once Matteo had sold fine Flemish cloth, there were only shuttered stalls and abandoned carts. Rats scurried openly among discarded produce. The smell of rot lingered even as city officials burned aromatic wood to ward off bad airs. One entry reads, April 18, no buyers today. Sent Giovanni to check on Daria's family. None answered. Gave him 2 silver for burial costs if needed. Supply chains collapsed. Shipments stopped. Not because of war or famine, but because no one wanted to touch anything that came from another place. Even gold lost its value, not in the sense of currency, but in urgency. When death waited at the door, what good was profit? Loss in the ledger. By early May, Matteo's diary becomes deeply personal. He writes of his wife's growing fear, of his children refusing to leave the house. He writes of trying to find bread, of neighbors who simply stopped answering knocks. May 6, wife ill, high fever, priest came, would not enter, gave blessing through the shutters. May 7, she is dead. Buried her at dawn with assistance from Francesco, could not find a proper coffin. There is no poetry, no lament, just the mechanical recording of unimaginable loss. Matteo's way of grieving is through documentation. His ink becomes his tears. Clerks in memory. Matteo was not alone in this practice. Across Florence and later throughout Europe, clerks, notaries, and merchants began to write not because they hoped others would read, but because it helped them to understand. They made inventories of the dead, cataloged debts unpaid, drew up wills for entire families on single scraps of parchment. Florence, so proud of its bureaucracy, had unwittingly trained a generation of chroniclers. Through their dull, methodical habits, we inherit the clearest picture of the plague's toll. They did not speak in metaphors. They spoke in florins, addresses, debts, and dates. And in those figures lies one of history's most intimate truths. Survival is often measured not by great speeches, but by those who keep counting after everyone else has stopped. The city council responds. By June, Florence's governing body, the Signoria, had all but ceased functioning. Several members had died, others had fled. Emergency committees were formed. New rules were issued. Bodies to be buried outside city walls. Bell ringing for funerals limited to prevent panic. People forbidden to gather in churches. Vagrants to be driven out or imprisoned. But enforcement was patchy. With so many dead or dying, laws became suggestions. Matteo notes one attempt by officials to clean the streets near his shop. He watched them sprinkle ash and lime over the cobblestones. a symbolic act more than a hygienic one. The real response came not from government, but from individuals' neighbors helping neighbors, or locking their doors to keep them out. A new kind of wealth. Curiously, as the death toll rose, a strange opportunity emerged. Houses were left vacant, land went unclaimed, goods sat untouched in warehouses. Mateo records on July 12th. Received letter from cousin in Prado, offered 2 vineyards for half their value, no heirs left alive, unsure if I should accept. Property changed hands rapidly. Inheritance laws were ignored. Survivors, often distant relations or unrelated claimants, enriched themselves accidentally or opportunistically. But Mateo hesitated. What good was wealth now? His entries turn philosophical. He wonders aloud if his children will remember this time, if Florence will recover, if the silence will ever lift. By late July, Mateo's diary tapers off. Whether from exhaustion or illness, we cannot know. His last entry reads simply, "Paid Stefano for burial of Lorenzo. Kept candle burning overnight. No mass said, too many dead." Through his eyes we see Florence not in ruins but in slow unraveling. Each day another thread snapped: an apprentice, a shipment, a neighbor, a wife, until the fabric of the city lay in tatters. But what became of Mateo? Did he survive? Did he rebuild his business or flee or fall into the dust with the rest? And if he lived, what kind of man emerged from the ledger's final line? By August of 1348, Florence was hollow. The sun still rose over the red rooftops, the Arno still flowed beneath its bridges, and the bells still rang, but rarely for mass, more often for mourning. Churches echoed with silence. Guild halls sat empty. No festivals lit the city squares. Even the sound of looms, the heartbeat of Florence's textile economy, had stopped. Estimates suggest that between 50% and 60% of Florence's population had died within 5 months. The streets bore the signs: shuttered homes, faded notices for the dead, and a new generation of weeds pushing up through the cobbles. What remained were survivors, some bewildered, some hardened, all changed. Among them, perhaps, was Matteo di Aldobrando, the cloth merchant whose diary had documented the city's descent into plague. While his entries became irregular after midsummer, a few pages later, in new handwriting but familiar tone, more lines appear. It seems Matteo lived on. Resuming the ledger. August 20, 1348. Resumed writing. Too much to record from past weeks. Florence altered beyond knowing. Took stock of warehouse, found 3 bolts of cloth undamaged. The tone is distant. The voice is quieter, slower. Matteo, like Florence itself, is cautious in his reawakening. His surviving apprentices are gone. His younger brother, last mentioned in early June, is not recorded again. Matteo now runs the shop alone. But the city is stirring. Other survivors open their windows. A few vendors return to the Piazza del Mercato. Bakers begin baking again, even if only for themselves. The first notes of birdsong are recorded, not as metaphor, but as fact. Heard songbirds again, no carts today. Small signs of life. Reclaiming the streets. City authorities, many replaced after mass resignations or death, begin to issue new decrees in September. Wages shall not exceed those paid before the plague. Orphans must be registered and placed with known families. A moratorium on debt collections for plague victims. Sanitation crews to be established for continued burial. The ordinances of labor reflect a growing anxiety among elites. With so many workers dead, artisans and laborers were demanding higher wages, refusing guild restrictions, and leaving traditional apprenticeships behind. Matteo records an interaction with a wool dyer who demanded double pay. He knows we need him more than he needs us. This single line captures a profound shift in social balance. The plague had shaken not only lives but class structures. Survivors had bargaining power, and they knew it. Economic triage. For Matteo, business resumes in fits and starts. He no longer deals in luxury cloth but in necessities: rough linen, undyed wool, basic thread. The foreign trade routes remain unreliable. Letters from Pisa and Lucca speak of unrest, of bandits on country roads, of entire towns refusing entry to travelers. Still, there is demand. Survivors need new clothing, new beds, new banners for funerals. Tailors, coopers, and masons are in short supply. The city that once measured itself by gold florins and fine silks now measures wealth in able bodies. Matteo notes: sold remaining cloth to orphan master sheets for new lodging hall. Received 6 barrels of grain in trade. No coin exchanged. Barter becomes common. Money remains, but trust in its value wavers. The economic machine stutters, then begins to reassemble itself not in grand banks, but in street-side exchanges and mutual necessity. Survivors and strangers. The demographic collapse brings new faces into Florence. With so many homes vacant, peasants from the countryside migrate inward. Some are welcomed, others blamed. Rumors spread of country folk stealing from the dead, occupying noble homes, or setting up illegal shops. Matteo writes with guarded curiosity. Met a mason from Fiesole who never knew his surname. Can carve stone like it sings. Hired him to repair shop window. This mingling of classes previously rigid and stratified becomes more common. Former nobles share piazzas with servants. Guild barriers weaken. And women, many now heads of household, assert newfound economic roles. There is no revolution, but there is quiet upheaval. The old Florence is not returning. A new one is assembling itself from the rubble. Grief without ceremony. If the spring was marked by panic and the summer by death, the autumn becomes a season of slow, aching grief. Florence's survivors walk through neighborhoods that no longer resemble home. They pass shuttered churches, empty gardens, and doorways covered in symbols: charcoal crosses, names of the dead, unclaimed inheritances. Matteo visits Santa Croce in October and notes: no choir, dust on altar, said prayer alone. Public mourning is rare. There are too few priests, too many names, too much silence. Funeral processions, once long and elaborate, are replaced with simple gestures: a candle in a window, a stone laid at a threshold, a page turned in a ledger. Some guilds begin commemorative rolls for the dead. A few begin organizing masses, but many, like Matteo, mourn in solitude. His writing grows more introspective. What was Florence made of before this? Trade, bells, saints. I remember a city, I see a shell. A city reimagined. Yet despite the grief, Florence begins to dream again. In late October, the Signoria commissions several artists, survivors themselves, to repaint the city's civic buildings. One commission demands frescoes of victory and protection, to ward off pestilence and restore confidence. It is not entirely successful. Fear remains, but it is a sign of intent. Builders begin to rework the city's infrastructure. Streets are widened in places. New burial grounds are constructed outside the walls. Regulations for air circulation in workshops are considered. A health office, though temporary, is formed. These aren't grand reforms, but seeds. They reflect a new awareness: cities can die, and thus they must learn how to live differently. Matteo's transformation. Matteo himself changes. Once a merchant of predictable habits, he now keeps irregular hours, trades in necessities, and sometimes offers cloth on credit to struggling families. He adopts a boy name unknown from the orphan registers. Luca, he writes, answers to it well enough. Matteo does not describe why, only that the boy sleeps near the ledger shelf and prefers hard bread. They rebuild together. In one poignant entry, Matteo writes, "He does not ask who I was, only what I have. Perhaps this is enough." In that line lies the quiet survival of countless plague-era households, strangers becoming family, mourning becoming memory, commerce becoming care. By the end of the year, Florence is no longer a city mourning the dead, it is a city made up only of survivors. Every face is marked by memory, every street echoes with absence, and yet people walk them again. They light fires, they sew garments, they teach their children the names of things. Matteo's ledger becomes less a business record than a journal of restoration. Each transaction is now a statement that life is still here, that Florence persists, even if changed forever. But change, as always, is not without cost. The final entries of the year raise a quiet question. If Florence was built on art, trade, and faith, what now will be its foundation? As 1348 gave way to 1349, Florence entered winter shrouded in stillness. The plague had receded, but its shadow lingered over every corner. The city's pulse, once vibrant, volatile, full of shouts, songs, and sermons, beat quieter now, less certain of itself. Those who remained walked its streets with care, listening not for danger but for signs of life. The bridges still stood, as did the churches, towers, and guild halls, but something invisible had shifted, not just in population, not just in wealth, but in what people believed Florence was, a place of learning, of commerce, of God's favor. For Matteo di Aldobrando, the merchant whose diary had captured the city's descent and struggle to recover, the question was not merely philosophical, it was practical. What was he rebuilding toward? What kind of Florence would rise from this silence? As his pen continued, Matteo documented not just sales and sorrows, but the birth of a new identity, one forged from memory, necessity, and quiet determination. Matteo's final accounts. Matteo's diary entries from early 1349 grow more reflective. The tone is slower, the pace of events more deliberate. January 6, Epiphany. Heard no choir, but Luca hummed something while cleaning pots. Perhaps I imagined it, perhaps not. He notes that the wool market is reopening, albeit slowly. Merchants from Pisa and Bologna have resumed correspondence. He trades with a Florentine widow who now manages her husband's shop. The entries are short, but their content is remarkable, a quiet return to normalcy. But Matteo no longer measures success in Florence. He notes things like children laughing near the well, or two women arguing over dye prices sounded like old times. These are the markers of survival. The ledger begins to resemble more a journal of daily rhythms than a business document. He writes of Luca's schooling, of new stonework in the piazza, of people returning to church hesitantly, and with masks of rosemary and vinegar-soaked cloth. The tone is never triumphant. It is always measured, hopeful perhaps, but always aware of how close they had come to losing everything. Death's place in daily life. One of the most lasting changes was how openly the city began to live in the presence of death. Before the plague, death had been ceremonial, confined to churches, buried under marble, spoken of in prayers. After the plague, death was ordinary. People passed plague pits on their way to market. Children were named after lost siblings. Masses were held for the unnamed dead. Saints' festivals now featured processions for divine protection from future pestilence. Matteo reflects on the shift. Death no longer surprises. It lives beside us like rain, like dusk. We do not fear it as we did. We simply nod to it and pass on. This was not resignation. It was adaptation. Florence had learned that to live was to carry death in your pocket, to greet it with sober familiarity, and to keep going. Orphans, widows, and the new Florence. With so many traditional family lines ended, inheritance laws were revised. Entire urban households were reshaped by necessity. Matteo's arrangement with Luca, once informal, becomes legally recognized in a short contract sealed with wax and scribbled Latin. Women, too, filled roles previously denied them. They owned shops, hired apprentices, even entered politics in subtle ways, sponsoring local priests, funding chapel restorations, negotiating grain prices. Matteo notes one such widow. Madonna Tessa commands her weavers like a knight, buys direct from Pisa, refuses credit even from nobility. Children of plague orphans grew up with blurred ideas of lineage and class. They were not the heirs of an old Florence. They were the architects of a new one, defined less by surnames and more by survival. Matteo observes, often without comment, how the lines between guilds, families, and classes bend. A world once structured by birthright now bends subtly toward merit and resilience. Rituals reclaimed. By mid-1349, rituals long abandoned began to return. Baptisms resumed. Bells tolled again, now for weddings as well as deaths. Guilds began reassembling their records and rolls. In May, Matteo writes, "Walked past Santa Maria Novella, choirboys again, sound uneven but honest, light caught in the stained glass as before. I stood there longer than I meant to." Florence, so defined by performance, its parades, festivals, religious processions, was learning how to perform again. Not to impress, but to remember. These rituals, however simple, served as anchors. They reminded the city of who it had been, or, at the very least, who it still could be. The rise of the chroniclers. Florence had always been a city of letters, of notaries, poets, and bankers fluent in numbers and words. But after the plague, writing took on a new urgency. People began recording everything, not just deaths and marriages, but thoughts, observations, grievances. Diaries became common. Testaments were written earlier in life. Even illiterate people hired scribes to record what they had seen. Matteo's own writing shifts in this period. His entries, once practical and short, now read more like meditations. "I am not certain who I was before this, only who I am among the dead. That is perhaps a beginning." This was part of a larger cultural turn, a new self-awareness in historical writing. Florence would, in time, produce works like Boccaccio's Decameron Tales, born directly from the plague's shadow, infused with humor, reflection, and biting social commentary. Matteo did not write stories, but he helped preserve the details that would make stories possible. Memory as monument. One of the few visible legacies of Matteo's later diary is the way he carefully lists the names of the dead, not in his family only, but in his neighborhood. Shoemakers, butchers, midwives, apprentice boys, foreigners, priests. No fanfare, just names. In his final entries of 1349, he writes, "These names I leave here, for no one else remembers them, but I do. I was their neighbor, their debtor, their friend." This quiet act of recording for the sake of remembrance becomes perhaps the most meaningful thing Matteo ever did, more lasting than any bolt of cloth sold, more profound than any florin earned. Memory becomes monument. Ink becomes stone. An end without an ending. Matteo's last entry in the ledger is dated December 21, 1349. It reads, "Paid the candlemaker, gave Luca new shoes. The city smells like chestnuts. Winter comes soft this year, I remain." There is no conclusion, no summary, no reflection beyond that. And perhaps that is fitting. The Black Death did not end with a grand event. It receded, it lingered, it returned in waves, but life slowly and carefully resumed. Florence survived, and in doing so it changed. Final reflection. The story of a merchant's diary in Florence is not a tale of epic survival or heroic deeds. It is the story of persistence, of how a man continued to write, to trade, to raise a child, to bear witness. It is about the power of the mundane, the importance of writing down what happens when everything falls apart. Through Matteo's pen, we see the shape of a society healing in uneven strokes through labor disputes, orphan adoptions, cracked stained glass, and the taste of roasted chestnuts in a quiet winter. Florence lost half its people, but it gained something else, a consciousness of its own fragility and a new voice to carry it forward. Still, one might ask, when the survivors rebuilt their city, did they choose to remember what it cost? Or, as with all cities, did they bury the past too deeply beneath the stones of their future? Story 3. The decay of feudal bonds in England. In the early 14th century, England was a land of hierarchy and obligation. At its heart was the manorial system, a finely tuned economic and social engine built on land, labor, and custom. Nearly 90% of the population lived in rural communities, working the land not as free citizens, but as villeins, unfree peasants bound by ancestral duty to serve their lord. In exchange for a parcel of land, these tenants owed labor, plowing, harvesting, sowing. They paid rents in grain and livestock, could not leave the manor without permission, and were tried in the Lord's court. The nobility, clergy, and crown all benefited from this web of enforced dependency. And then came the plague. Between 1348 and 1350, England, like much of Europe, lost up to half of its population. Entire villages vanished, fields went untended, churches were locked, priors, reeves, and bailiffs died without replacement. But the survivors, especially the peasants, found themselves with something unprecedented. Leverage. This is the story of how the Black Death began, the long, slow unraveling of the feudal system in England, not with fire or revolution, but with a whispered no from the fields. Life before the plague, rules etched in earth. Before the Black Death, village life followed a rigid rhythm. Take, for instance, the manor of Cuxham in Oxfordshire. Its surviving records show a stable structure, some 20 households, a mill, a church, and several acres of communal land divided by obligation. William Attest Stone, a villain in Cuxham, owed 2 days of plowing each week. In addition, he paid a bushel of oats yearly, 2 hens at Martinmas, and worked during the Lord's harvest without pay. If he wished to marry his daughter, sell his oxen, or leave for another village, he needed the Lord's consent and often a fee. Such arrangements had existed for generations. Even free tenants remained deeply embedded in manorial jurisdiction. Customary law ruled daily life more than royal decrees. While grumblings existed and some tried to flee obligations, enforcement was strict. The structure held. Then in June of 1349, the plague reached Cuxham. Death among the bound. Cuxham's records that summer become fragmented. The court rolls usually filled with fines for lateness or grazing animals illegally suddenly shift to record the dead. Hugh Carter, deceased. Holdings to pass to widow if she can perform service. The reeve dead, no man elected in his place. Fields left unplowed, wheat unsown. The plague struck unevenly. Some manors lost 1/3 of their population, others more. Servants died alongside their lords. In some cases, whole lineages ended. In others, children inherited manors too young to manage them. But the most dramatic change was this: there were not enough peasants left to work the land. Lords in crisis. For generations, landlords had operated with a surplus of labor. If a villain fled, another took their place. But in the wake of the plague, this balance shattered. Labor shortages gripped the countryside. Crops failed not for lack of seed, but for lack of hands to sow them. Lords attempted to enforce traditional duties, but villagers pushed back. In a manor near Ely, the bailiff wrote in 1350, "Only 4 tenants remain. 2 refuse to work their week, say they can earn more elsewhere, disobedience growing." Some lords offered wages to entice laborers unthinkable under serfdom. Others lowered rents, forgave debts, or offered free tenancies to anyone who would farm their lands. Entire villages were repeopled with bargaining peasants. What had once been unthinkable, a villain, nomming his own terms, became the new reality. The ordinance of laborers, the crown reacts. In 1349, the English crown passed a sweeping order, the Ordinance of Laborers. It declared, wages must remain at pre-plague levels. Able-bodied men and women must accept work if offered. Refusal to work was punishable by imprisonment. All previous customs were to remain enforced. The law aimed to restore the old order, to prevent workers from extorting lords and inflating wages. But enforcement was spotty. Many justices of the peace were themselves landowners and reluctant to punish those they needed. Laborers moved between manors, lying about their origins, working where terms were best. Mobility increased. Instead of quelling rebellion, the ordinance confirmed something else. The feudal order was in retreat, even if not in name. The voice of the peasant. We rarely hear from peasants directly, but one remarkable record survives in the form of petitions and depositions in court cases from the 1350s and 1360s. In one, a man named Robert of Bocking, a former villein, argued before the manor court. I will not serve the Lord as before. He needs me as I need the land. Let us meet as equals. The court fined him, but records suggest he returned without punishment to the same fields, but now paid for his labor. Others took their chances elsewhere. Some joined the bands of itinerant workers that wandered the countryside, offering their tools to the highest bidder. A few reached towns, took up trades, and never returned. The plague had loosened the soil beneath feudalism, not with rebellion, but with quiet negotiations, refusals, disappearances. Decline of the lord's authority. Not all lords resisted the change. Some, faced with mounting losses, leaned into the new order. They leased their lands rather than demand labor. Others turned to pastoral farming. Sheep needed fewer hands than wheat. The manorial accounts begin to shift in language. Terms like merchant, the fine for a daughter's marriage, or Harriet, a death duty, fade from records. Instead, cash rents and labor contracts appear. In some cases, villages bought their own freedom, paying a lump sum to dissolve manorial obligations. Others collapsed entirely, becoming deserted medieval villages, their stones swallowed by fields. Feudalism was not abolished, but it was thinned, its obligations eroded by economics, demographics, and time. A turning point unnoticed. By 1370, a generation had passed. The children born after the plague grew up in a world where mobility was possible, where service could be refused, and where land could be leased, not inherited. Lords lamented the loss of obedience. Chroniclers grumbled about lazy peasants and women dressing above their station. But the truth was simpler. Survivors knew their worth. The value of labor had changed. So had the value of consent. The system had not collapsed with revolt, but with millions of quiet calculations by individuals who saw, for the first time, that they had a choice. The Black Death did not topple England's feudal system overnight. No castles burned. No monarchs were overthrown. But in villages like Cuxham and fields across the Midlands, a slow disobedience took root. Peasants stopped showing up, stopped obeying, stopped believing they were powerless. And the question arises, if power is built on obedience, what happens when that obedience dies quietly, buried with the dead? By the early 1350s, England had entered a strange, unsettled phase, not quite post-feudal, not yet modern. The manorial structure still stood, but it was hollowing out from within. The great lords still held land, but they no longer commanded automatic obedience. Fields were still plowed, but by men who now demanded pay or walked away. What had begun as a crisis of population was rapidly becoming a crisis of legitimacy. The Black Death had not just created labor shortages, it had revealed the fragility of the social contract that tied peasant to lord. Without the threat of replacement, obligation faltered. This section explores the economic realities and lived experiences of England's post-plague peasantry, how scarcity created opportunity. how the crown tried to pull the reins, and how freedom was bought, bargained, or simply assumed. Wage inflation and opportunity. Before the plague, a day laborer might earn 2 or 3 pence for manual work. After 1349, the same labor could fetch 6 pence, sometimes more. A plowman might earn up to double the old rate, and masons, carpenters, and shepherds even more. This was not a result of policy, it was supply and demand. With up to half the working population gone, landowners faced failing crops, unpaid rents, and empty homes. To survive, they offered better terms, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes eagerly. One steward in Essex wrote in 1351, "No man would thresh grain under 5 pence, though we offered them meat and ale besides." And for peasants, especially young men and unmarried women, this meant mobility. They could move between manors, seek seasonal work, or even negotiate contracts directly. Labor was becoming a commodity, not a duty. Migration and the breaking of ties. The plague had shattered local continuity. With whole families dead, many manors had no clear heirs, no long-standing ties to the land. New tenants arrived from other villages, sometimes even from distant shires. This migration, illegal under older feudal law, became commonplace. Lords had no choice but to accept outsiders, often offering reduced rents or entry fines, in place of traditional oaths of service. One tenant in Wiltshire was recorded as from nowhere, paying 6 shillings annually, no work required. Even more telling are the court roll absences. Individuals who simply disappeared from manorial records, never fined, never pursued. They had slipped away into towns, into forests, into new identities. The feudal grip was not broken with rebellion, but with quiet abandonment. The Statute of Laborers, 1351, a law against reality. In response to this labor flux, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. It attempted to do what the Ordinance of Laborers had failed to do in 1349: fix wages at pre-plague levels, force able-bodied men and women to work for their lord or for local employers, and penalize those who defied this order. It declared, "No man shall take more for his labor than he was accustomed to. Every person under 60 years of age shall be bound to serve. Refusers shall be imprisoned." But the law was doomed from the start. Local justices rarely enforced it. Many were landowners themselves, and others recognized the futility of punishing laborers they desperately needed. Some tried public shamming, others imprisoned. A few examples, but for every worker fined, a dozen others quietly took better offers elsewhere. The statute, in effect, created a black market of labor, where contracts were made in secret and workers traveled under assumed names. Feudalism had once depended on visibility: who owed whom, who was born where. Now, invisibility was a tool of survival. The rise of the wage laborer. The manorial economy had long functioned through customary service. Villains owed a set number of days per year, plus extra work during harvest. But by the 1350s, more and more lords began leasing out their domain land, the land once farmed, directly for the lord's benefit. Rather than find enough laborers to plow and reap, they rented the land to individual tenants, who paid a fixed fee and bore the risk of the harvest. This created a new class of tenant farmers, many of them formerly bound villeins. Some remained on the same land but now paid cash instead of labor. Others hired workers, becoming small-scale employers themselves. And in towns, former peasants took up trades. The laborer was no longer nameless and replaceable. He had a price, a choice, and increasingly a voice. The resistance of the lords. Not all lords adapted gracefully. Many resisted the changes with anger and litigation. In the records of the manor of Bridgwater, Somerset, a 1352 entry reads, "John Ford refuses customary labor, demands coin in place of plowing, threatens to depart, Lord refuses, court fined him sixpence. He did not appear. Elsewhere, landlords reasserted old rights, demanding the heriot, a death duty, or refusing to allow marriages or land transfers without fines. But their power was eroding. In manor after manor, stewards complained of disobedient tenants, of missing men, of fields untended because none will serve for the usual fee. What was once custom had become negotiation, and often the lords lost. The role of women. One overlooked shift in the post-plague years was the changing role of women in rural society. With male mortality high, widows inherited land more frequently. Some remarried quickly, others did not. Records show a rise in women leasing domain lands, appearing in court rolls and hearing labor. In Sussex, a woman named Alice Hall held over 30 acres of leased land by 1360, employed 2 ploughmen, and negotiated directly with the steward. The feudal system had rarely accounted for women as economic agents, but the plague, indifferent to gender, had created gaps that needed filling, and women stepped in, often for the first time. Though not a revolution in status, it was a redefinition of visibility, and it changed the social fabric of the countryside. Seeds of unrest. By the 1370s, discontent simmered. Wages were still restricted by law, though widely flouted. Old lords still tried to enforce feudal duties, though increasingly powerless. A new generation of peasants born after the plague did not remember feudal obedience. In some villages, collective refusals became common. Whole communities began to push back against lordly claims. The friction would boil over in 1381, when a major tax revolt known as the Peasants' Revolt would shake the kingdom. But even before rebellion, defiance had become normalized. As one chronicler would later put it, "The poor no longer know their place, and the lords no longer command without question." The Black Death did not destroy England's feudal system with fire or sword. It broke it with empty chairs at the plough, with silent court rolls, with mothers running farms, with men walking away from service, with stewards scratching their heads, unsure how to make the fields yield again. It was a slow erosion, a death by negotiation, by desertion, by disobedience. And as the decades wore on, the question became clear. When a society built on obedience no longer commands respect, what replaces it, and who decides the new rules? By the final decades of the 14th century, the England that had once been defined by feudal custom, rigid hierarchy, and inherited obligation was no longer recognizable, not because of any grand political shift, nor because of deliberate reform, but because the foundation of that world had quietly crumbled beneath the weight of absence. The Black Death had taken the people, but in doing so, it had also taken the consent, the submission, and the economic logic that kept feudalism in motion. What emerged in its place was not fully formed, nor entirely understood, but it was something new. A world where labor could walk away, where villagers knew their worth, and where lords learned to bargain. We follow the closing phase of this transformation from the 1370s to the early 15th century, through the lens of records, revolts, and the slow institutional retreat of the manorial model. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a flashpoint. If the decades after the Black Death were marked by quiet erosion, 1381 brought an eruption. The Peasants' Revolt, sometimes known as the Great Rising, was sparked not only by a controversial poll tax but also by generations of frustration. With rising rents, legal restrictions, and the Crown's attempts to claw back labor control. It began in Essex and Kent, fueled by preachers like John Ball, who famously asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, and even former villeins marched on London, demanding the end of serfdom, fixed rents instead of feudal dues, Free labor markets. Legal equality under royal law. The revolt was ultimately crushed, its leaders executed, its promises revoked. But something deeper had shifted. The state could repress rebellion, but it could not unwrite demographic reality. Even in defeat, the rebellion underscored what lords already feared. The old world was not coming back. Manorial records in decline. From the 1380s onward, manor court rolls began to thin. The documents that had once recorded dozens of fines per session absences, late harvests, marriages without license began to feature blank pages, short sessions, or abrupt discontinuities. The once busy language of customary law faded. Instead, scribes recorded. Tenant absent, presumed gone. Land left vacant, unable to reassign. Rents unpaid, bailiff dismissed. This wasn't rebellion, it was abandonment. The entire system was hollowing from the inside out. With no villains to fine and few willing to replace them, the legal machinery of feudal enforcement became ceremonial at best. Many manors ceased holding courts at all. Others turned entirely to leasehold farming, accepting fixed cash rents instead of service. What had once been a web of rights and duties became, in essence, a simple contract. The end of villainage. By the early 15th century, the term villain was still used in law but increasingly obsolete in practice. A growing number of peasants, many of whom had once been bound, now lived as copy holders, tenants who held land based on written agreements recorded in manorial rolls. Leaseholders, renting land for fixed terms, sometimes with rights of inheritance. Freeholders, owning land outright, still rare but growing. Legal scholars of the period began to note that feudal obligations could no longer be enforced in many parts of the countryside. Courts hesitated to pursue cases against tenants who had long since become de facto free. Some lords attempted to reassert old claims, often using century-old customs, but found little success. Bailiffs were ignored, peasants refused to attend court, and increasingly, even the gentry preferred cash rents over quarreling with a dwindling and assertive tenant base. By 1425, villainage in its original sense had largely ceased to function, even if it lingered on paper. A new rural economy. The death of serfdom did not mean the birth of prosperity, but it reshaped the countryside. Across England, new patterns emerged. Tenant farmers, many formerly villeins, now worked their own land or leased large plots. Enclosures began to rise, lords fencing off common land for sheep pastures, reducing reliance on human labor entirely. Wage labor became the norm, especially among younger rural workers. Servants and apprentices replaced hereditary roles with fixed terms. The rural economy was becoming market-driven. Peasants sold produce at local markets. Some accumulated enough to buy additional leases or small properties. Others moved to towns in search of trade or craft work. Lords, too, adjusted, turning to commercial agriculture, exporting wool, and shifting their income from rents and tithes to trade and capital. Feudalism had been rooted in immobility and permanence. The post-plague world demanded flexibility and negotiation. Memory and myth. It's worth noting that the decay of feudal bonds was not widely celebrated. Chroniclers, clerics, and even some peasants mourned the loss of order, fearing the rise of greed, vanity, and disobedient youth. In one Yorkshire account from the 1390s, an aging monk wrote, "Once, men bowed their heads and knew their place. Now they speak back to their betters and wear coats finer than knights." But the reality was more complex. The system had collapsed not out of rebellion, but because it no longer matched the world it governed. And the people who adapted, first peasants, women, younger sons, found opportunity in its ruins. Echoes in law and culture. The final stage of this transformation was legal recognition. In the 15th century, new court structures replaced manorial jurisdiction in many areas. Landholding was increasingly framed in contractual terms, not customary ones. The language of rights and freedom began to spread not yet in a revolutionary sense, but in day-to-day economic life. The Black Death had reordered the moral logic of labor. Work was no longer a duty owed to one's lord, but a service exchanged for coin and often on the worker's terms. This quiet revolution did not storm castles, it simply refused to return to them. The decay of feudal bonds in England was not a clean break. It was a slow, uneven, and often invisible unraveling. It began in empty fields and court absences, in wage disputes and vanished villeins. It was propelled not by ideology, but by demography, by opportunity, and by the quiet courage to say no, where once only obedience had existed. By the end of the 15th century, England was no longer a feudal kingdom in practice. It was a society in transition toward capital, toward labor mobility, toward the early outlines of what would become modern economics. And yet the lingering question remains. When freedom comes not from revolution, but from disaster, can it truly be called freedom, or is it just a shift in burdens, dressed in new language? Story 4. The collapse of the Hanseatic trade network. In the 14th century, the Baltic and North Seas were not empty blue stretches, they were corridors of commerce, studded with sails and echoing with the creak of hulls and the clang of harbor bells. This was the domain of the Hanseatic League, a confederation of German-speaking merchant guilds and market towns, bound not by a crown or religion, but by trade. At its height, the League controlled over 200 towns, from Novgorod in the east to Bruges in the west, and from Bergen in Norway to Krakow in Poland. It moved goods vital to medieval life: salt, grain, wax, fur, timber, beer, and cloth. The great port of Lübeck served as its unofficial capital, a place where legal codes, treaties, and prices were agreed in the hum of stone halls lit by whale oil lamps. But like all human systems, the League was not immune to catastrophe. When the Black Death arrived in northern Europe around 1349, it traveled not by warhorse or caravan but in the holds of merchant cogs, carried by sailors and rats alike. This is the story of how a pandemic rooted the arteries of trade, shattered alliances, and exposed the fragile machinery behind one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated commercial networks. The foundations of the Hands. Before the plague, the Hanseatic League thrived on mutual protection and standardization. Towns like Hamburg, Cologne, and Danzig, Gdansk, agreed to uphold common weights and measures, to respect one another's trading privileges, and to offer protection for ships and merchants in foreign ports. Kontor's permanent trading outposts were established in key cities like London, Novgorod, and Bruges, allowing Hanseatic merchants to operate with considerable autonomy. They were enclosed enclaves, complete with their own warehouses, chapels, and even legal jurisdictions. Goods flowed with the seasons. Salt from Lüneburg preserved the herring caught in Scania. Grain from Prussia fed cities where local harvests failed. Wool from England met Flemish weavers through Hanseatic intermediaries. It was a web dense, multilingual, deeply bureaucratic, and astonishingly effective. But it was also a web dependent on presence, on skilled navigators, trusted contacts, scribes, translators, and guild masters who knew the rhythms of every market. When the plague came, it severed these threads one by one. Lübeck, the hub, staggers. In 1349, Lübeck was thriving. As the primary Hanseatic court, it processed disputes, coordinated convoys, and hosted the Hanseattag, the League's periodic assembly. Its shipyards echoed with construction, its warehouses bulged with resin, timber, and cloth. But when the plague arrived, likely from Hamburg or Bremen, everything paused. Contemporary accounts mention entire merchant houses closing. Dockworkers died mid-task. Local authorities, unsure how to manage the spread, suspended convoys, closed gates, and forbade public gatherings. The Hansetag of 1350 was cancelled, the first such disruption in decades. With no central authority coordinating schedules, port timetables fell apart. Ships missed one another, contracts lapsed, and merchants from more distant cities, especially in Sweden and Livonia, began to question Lübeck's reliability. A system that had once prided itself on predictability was now riddled with silence. Novgorod and the Eastern disruption. Far to the east, the Hanseatic contour at Novgorod, known as the Peterhof, had long been a hub for furs, wax, and hides. It relied on tight seasonal schedules. Merchants had to leave Lübeck before the rivers froze, arrive in spring, and return before autumn rains made roads impassable. The Black Death disrupted this delicate clockwork. Though the plague reached Novgorod more slowly than western ports, the disruption came earlier, with the withdrawal of western merchants. Fewer ships made the journey. Those that did often arrived without sufficient crew or too late to trade. In 1351, a merchant named Matthias von Greifswald complained in a letter. "The bear fat is spoiled, the wax brittle. No man here can speak Latin or write the old accounts. We leave poorer than we came." Without fresh goods, Novgorod's warehouse stocks dwindled. Prices became erratic. Trust began to erode both among local Russian traders and the German merchants who depended on them. By the 1360s, the contour at Novgorod was no longer a stable outpost. It was a fatting satellite, barely tethered to the Hanseatic core. Bergen and the North Atlantic weakness. In Bergen, Norway, the Hanseatic presence had always been precarious. Merchants lived in designated areas, the Briggen, and were subject to seasonal controls. They exported stockfish, air-dried cod, and imported grain and cloth. The plague's impact in Norway was severe. Entire coastal communities vanished. And when German merchants stopped arriving, or arrived too late, the fragile economy of the Norwegian coast buckled. In some cases, Hanseatic traders refused to enter cities at all, dropping cargo off at remote harbors, avoiding contact, and leaving before local authorities could negotiate. This destroyed relationships. Norwegian elites, already resentful of German dominance, began to rescind Hanseatic privileges. By the 1370s, violent clashes between German and Norwegian traders erupted, some fatal. Fear, once a distant rumor, had become a factor in trade routes. Sailors no longer feared only pirates or storms, but infection, isolation, and political reprisal. The collapse of convoy coordination. A critical strength of the Hanseatic League had been its ability to coordinate protected merchant convoys, groups of ships that sailed together under agreed rules, often armed, and under communal contracts. The plague scattered this system. Shipmasters died mid-voyage. Replacement crews were inexperienced. Ports were closed or quarantined. Insurances lapsed. Letters of passage were delayed. Some ships sailed alone, dangerous and inefficient. Others never left harbor at all. By 1352, a letter from a Gdansk merchant recorded, "3 ships from Cologne failed to meet us in Bruges. The convoy sailed without them. None of us made profit." The Hanseatic League depended on reliability, but plague made delay a constant, and in commerce, delay often means ruin. Competition creeps in. While Hanseatic cities faltered, non-Hanseatic competitors took notice. English and Dutch traders, less affected initially by the plague, began to move into former Hanseatic strongholds like London and Bruges. Local nobles in Sweden and Norway encouraged alternative trading routes, hopping to loosen German dominance. In Flanders, French merchants, once marginalized, gained ground as German coordination failed. The League, once seen as a stable bloc, was increasingly viewed as fragmented, even vulnerable. The strength of the Hands had never been its fleets or its fortresses, but its shared routines. When those broke, its influence did too. The Hanseatic League was not defeated by war, nor by trade policy, but by a microscopic organism that cared nothing for salt routes or customs codes. The Black Death didn't destroy the League outright, but it exposed its dependence on human continuity, on scribes who remembered old contracts, on translators who knew both Russian and Middle Low German, on shipmasters who knew which fjord to dock in. When those people died when their roles were unfilled, the system wobbled. And in that wobble, trust frayed, timetables broke, and rivals slipped in. Still, the League would survive limping, adapting, but it would never again be what it was. And so the question emerges: can any system built on rhythm and repetition survive when the human hands that keep time fall still? By the mid-1350s, the Hanseatic League was no longer expanding, it was surviving. And survival, unlike growth, is not a unified effort. It's a collection of improvisations, delays, and self-interested decisions. The Black Death had transformed a tightly woven federation into a network of isolated responses, as each Hanseatic city and trading post faced its own local disaster, with limited support from the League's paralyzed center in Lubeck. What had once been a coordinated commercial empire became a mosaic of ad hoc policies and fractured priorities. This section explores how the Hanseatic League's member cities navigated the years immediately after the plague's first wave, how rivalries sharpened, protections failed, and the very idea of collective security began to fray. Bruges, the western anchor, wobbles. Bruges was a jewel of Hanseatic trade in the west, a magnet for wool, wine, salt, and luxury cloth. The German merchants in Bruges had their own quarter, complete with warehouses, chapels, and legal privileges. Their presence was tolerated and often welcomed by Flemish officials, who benefited from customs revenues. But after the plague, relationships soured. Local workers who had suffered immense losses began to resent the continued privileges granted to foreign merchants. Wages were rising, and so were prices, but German traders insisted on honoring pre-plague contracts. When Bruges tried to impose new tariffs and regulations, the Hanseatic merchants protested, then paused shipments. A letter from the Bruges City Council in 1355 reads, "Let it be known that should the League refuse our customs, their privileges here will be reviewed with due firmness." The conflict simmered for years. While trade continued, the trust that had once underpinned the Hanseatic presence began to erode. The plague had made everyone poorer and more protective of their own margins. Internal competition, rival cities, rival goals. Before the Black Death, the League had a clear internal logic. Lubeck managed Baltic affairs, Cologne dominated the Rhine, Hamburg bridged the North Sea, and Danzig, Riga, and Reval served the Eastern Front. But after the plague, economic recovery was uneven. Some cities rebounded quickly, others languished. As a result, intercity cooperation weakened, and local interests took precedence over collective strategy. Lubeck attempted to restore convoy coordination, but found fewer cities willing to contribute ships or crews. Danzig began negotiating directly with the Teutonic Knights, bypassing Hanseatic mediation. Hamburg struck independent deals with English wool merchants, angering partners in Cologne. Rostock accused Wismar of hoarding shipbuilding supplies. A once cohesive federation began to look like a confederation in name only, with members picking and choosing when to honor the old agreements. The League's power had never been centralized, it depended on voluntary cooperation. And in the post-plague world, voluntary was no longer reliable. The crisis of the contours. The plague also devastated the contour system, the Hanseatic trading colonies, abroad that acted as anchors of influence in foreign cities. Each contour was more than a warehouse. It was a mini-embassy, a legal jurisdiction, and a cultural home for hundreds of merchants. But plague changed everything. In London, xenophobia increased. German merchants were blamed for high food prices and declining wages. The steelyard, the League's base, faced new taxes and restrictions. In Bruges, as noted earlier, Hanseatic privileges were challenged and renegotiated. In Novgorod, the Peterhof became increasingly isolated. Fewer merchants ventured east, and those who did returned with empty hulls or tales of suspicion and loss. Perhaps the most emblematic sign of decline came in 1360, when the Peterhof in Novgorod burned to the ground, likely by accident. It was eventually rebuilt, but more modestly, and its influence never fully recovered. The contours, once proud symbols of Hanseatic reach, became reminders of fragility. Without people, without trust, without steady flows of goods, they were just foreign enclaves waiting to be forgotten. The merchant's dilemma. At the heart of the League were individual merchants, many of them from middling guilds, who depended on safe passage, predictable markets, and the backing of collective agreements. But post-plague, they faced a dilemma. Do they trust the League to protect their rights, even as it flounders? Or do they cut private deals, accept local terms, and forego communal privileges? More and more chose the latter. A merchant from Stralsund, writing in 1357, records, "In Bruges they now ask for higher dues. I pay them. Better to pay than to return with an empty ship. Lübeck protests, but I do not sail for Lübeck's honor. I sail for my bread." This sentiment was echoed throughout the League. Survival trumped principle, and when enough merchants began to act independently, the League's bargaining power declined. It was not defiance, it was adaptation. Disease and distrust. The League's ability to function depended heavily on its reputation for reliability. Merchants needed to know that ports would honor contracts, that partner cities would uphold agreements, and that convoys would arrive as promised. The Black Death shattered that sense of reliability. Worse, it introduced new layers of suspicion. Was that cargo of rye from Danzig infected? Did sailors from Riga bring the pestilence to Wismar? Are English towns closing to Hanseatic goods because of politics or fear of disease? The result was a rise in port closures, quarantine demands, and arbitrary embargoes. Trade became not just a logistical challenge, but a social gamble. One memorandum from Lübeck in 1358 warned, "Our goods rot in harbor, not from neglect, but from refusal. Doors that once opened with coin now close with silence." In the end, the greatest casualty of the plague may have been the quiet assumption that, despite differences, cities would keep their word. A new trade map emerging. Even as the Hanseatic League stumbled, new players were stepping into the void. The English crown, sensing opportunity, offered direct privileges to Dutch and Flemish cities. Scandinavian kingdoms, weakened by plague and internal strife, began looking westward for alliances, bypassing the Hands. Italian merchants, always distant in the north, began to appear in Bruges and Hamburg, dealing in luxury cloth and silver. By 1365, the League was no longer the undisputed power of northern European trade. It remained significant, but it was sharing space with newer, faster, and often more flexible competitors. The map of trade was redrawing itself not with borders, but with routes of preference. The Hanseatic League's collapse was not dramatic. It did not fall to foreign invasion or to internal revolt. Instead, it sagged slowly under the weight of its own assumptions. The Black Death revealed that cooperation, like trust, like routine, is a living thing. It requires people to nurture it, enforce it, believe in it. When those people died, and when their replacements no longer remembered why the rules existed, the system they'd built began to wither. And yet the League endured, even in diminished form. But one must ask, is survival enough when the soul of a system, the confidence, the cadence, the common cause, is no longer shared? By the late 14th century, the Hanseatic League still existed, Ships still flew the banners of Lübeck and Hamburg. Markets reopened. Warehouses filled once more. The plague had not killed the League, but it had cracked its spine, leaving it stooped, hesitant, and increasingly reliant on a memory of its former strength. What followed was not rebirth, but adaptation through contraction. The League would stumble forward into the 15th century, occasionally asserting its muscle through diplomacy or force, but it would never again command the systemic dominance it once held over northern European trade. This final section examines how the League navigated its long twilight through military campaigns, reforms, and alliances born of necessity. It ends not with collapse, but with a question. What happens when a great system continues on, long after its spirit has died? The Wendish alliance and militarization. In the 1360s, the Hanseatic League attempted to assert itself more forcefully. A group of core cities, primarily Lübeck, Wismar, Rostock, and Stralsund, formed what became known as the Wendish Alliance, named for the Baltic coastal region they dominated. The alliance sought to protect trade routes militarily, investing in armed convoys, port defenses, and coordinated blockades. The naval war against Denmark, 1361–1370, sparked by King Valdemar IV's attempts to dominate the Øresund Straits, became the League's defining show of force. Using hired fleets and merchant ships converted for battle, the League blockaded Copenhagen, disrupted royal revenues, and eventually forced Denmark to sign the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370, a major political win that restored Hanseatic privileges. But the victory was misleading. The war cost vast sums. Several member cities refused to participate. Others profited privately by trading behind the League's back. The illusion of unity had been maintained only by immediate necessity. Once peace returned, so did division. The plague had not just disrupted trade, it had weakened the League's ability to speak with one voice. A turn inward, bureaucracy over brotherhood. In the decades following the plague, the Hanseatic League became more administratively complex, even as its social cohesion frayed. The Hansetag became more frequent but less decisive, filled with disagreements. Codified rules expanded. Shipping regulations, dispute resolution procedures, protocols for member conduct. Dozens of new committees were formed, but with limited enforcement power. A common criticism from the period, the League now has many pens but few oars. This bureaucratization was a kind of coping mechanism. With fewer shared instincts and diminished trust, the League tried to impose order on uncertainty through parchment. But trade thrives not on paperwork alone, it requires confidence, presence, and familiarity. And these, in the wake of demographic collapse and regionalism, could not be inked into being. The dimming of the contours. By the mid-1400s, the contour system, once the beating heart of Hanseatic strategy, was in retreat. The steelyard in London faced new taxes, stricter controls, and growing hostility from English traders and the Crown. The contour in Bruges suffered, as silt choked the Zwin River and redirected commerce to Antwerp. The Peterhof in Novgorod became vulnerable to the rising power of Muscovy and suffered repeated closures. These were not single moments of collapse, but long, slow diminutions marked by neglected repairs, reduced staffing, and fewer ships docking each year. Contours had relied on a steady stream of cooperative merchants who knew the rhythms of a given region, but plague had broken generational continuity. New merchants lacked old loyalties. Fewer sons took their father's trade routes. The web that once stitched Lübeck to London to Novgorod unraveled at the edges, thread by thread. Climate crisis and the long shadow of the plague. Though the Black Death's initial wave ended by the early 1350s, recurring outbreaks haunted the League every few decades, and they came alongside other pressures. The Little Ice Age brought colder winters, shorter growing seasons and crop failures. Flooding disrupted lowland towns and washed away infrastructure. Political instability in Poland, Scandinavia, and the Holy Roman Empire threatened overland routes. New technologies like the printing press and cannon shifted the cultural and military balance of power. The plague had not only killed, it had compressed the medieval world into a tighter, more precarious shape. And the Hanseatic League, once expansive and confident, found itself on the defensive. It adjusted where it could, rebuilt where it must, but the golden age of Hanseatic predictability had passed. A new economic order. By the early 1500s, the League's dominance had been largely eclipsed. The rise of centralized nation-states, particularly England, and the Netherlands meant merchants could now rely on state navies and diplomacy. Antwerp, with its deep harbor and royal backing, overtook Bruges as the preeminent northern European port. English cloth traders, Dutch herring fleets, and Scandinavian timber merchants began to operate independently of the Hanse. The age of exploration opened entirely new trade routes, bypassing the Baltic entirely. The Hanseatic League still existed on paper, in legal charters in the names of ships and buildings, but it was increasingly symbolic, a respected relic, not an active force. A league that once boasted over 200 towns saw only a dozen active members by the 17th century. The last echoes. In 1669, the League held its final official Hansetag in Lübeck. Only 9 cities attended. No great treaties were signed. No major declarations were made. There was no formal dissolution, no grand farewell. The League simply ceased to matter, outpaced by the modernizing world, outlived by the crises it had once managed. It remained a name, a history, and for the cities that once thrived under its protection, a memory built into docks, ledgers, and stone walls. End of story 4. Final reflection. The story of the Hanseatic League is not a tragedy. It is a study in quiet disintegration. A system that had mastered the sea lanes, standardized international commerce, and built mutual legal frameworks long before the modern state existed, undone not by conquest, but by infection, disruption, and inertia. The Black Death did not sink the League's ships, but it took the men who steered them, the clerks who copied the contracts, the dockworkers who knew which barrels to trust. It cut the cords of continuity. And in its wake, the League did not fall. It drifted, slowly losing relevance as the world moved on. Still, one must wonder, how many of our own institutions, built on routine and trust, would survive if the people at their core simply disappeared? Story 5. The Empty Villages of Provence. Provence, a name that today evokes hillsides draped in lavender, sun-warmed stone cottages, and olive groves stretching to the horizon. But in the mid-14th century, this region in southern France became a theater of disappearance. Between 1347 and 1352, the Black Death swept through Provence not once, but in multiple waves amplified by trade routes from the Italian peninsula, by pilgrims to Avignon, and by the seasonal movements of rural laborers and livestock. Unlike the bustling cities of Florence or Paris, Provence was composed mostly of villages, small, self-sufficient communities, often no more than 20 or 30 households, nestled in valleys or clinging to the edges of low hills. When the plague came, it didn't just reduce populations, it erased them. And what it left behind was not devastation in the traditional sense, but silence. Farms abandoned, wells untended, churches locked and never reopened. Entire settlements disappeared from the record, swallowed by vines, soil, and time. This story follows the quiet extinction of these villages, sans voir the voiceless villages of Provence, and the ghostly footprints they left behind. Rural Provence before the plague. Life in rural Provence in the early 1300s was humble, but relatively stable. Villagers raised sheep, pressed olives, grew wheat and vines, and paid taxes or tithes to local seigneurs, often ecclesiastical lords such as abbeys or bishoprics. Villages such as Les Crottes, Saint-Pierre-de-Mézorgues, or Verquières show up in tax rolls, land grants, and church records. Most were structured around a central church, a communal oven, perhaps a mill. Roads were often little more than worn tracks. People rarely moved far from home. Generations lived in the same stone dwellings, passed land through family lines, and marked time by seasons and feast days. Though there were conflicts between noble houses or over grazing rights, the rhythms of life were local and deeply rooted. And it was precisely this rootedness that made the coming plague so devastating. These were not cities with layered institutions. These were communities held together by proximity and memory. The first wave, 1348. The Black Death likely entered Provence through the port of Marseille in early 1348, carried by merchant vessels from Italy. Within months, it had reached Aix-en-Provence, Avignon, and the surrounding countryside. Avignon, as the seat of the Avignon papacy, became a major epicenter. The Pope's court burned aromatic woods continuously, and bodies were buried in mass graves so large that carts tipped them in by the hundreds. But while cities received attention, writings, chronicles, clerical records, rural death went largely unrecorded. We know what happened in the villages by what stopped appearing. Church registers cease. Tax rolls list names with notes. Mortus est, he is dead. Property transfers halt altogether. In some cases, an entire village simply vanishes from documentation. No lawsuits, no marriages, no baptisms, just a final entry in the notary's ledger. And then nothing. Abandonment, the anatomy of vanishing. How does a village disappear? Step by step, a shepherd dies, his flock wanders, his cousin tries to manage it and falls ill. The village priest offers last rites until he too is taken. A handful of survivors flee, some to larger towns, others to monasteries or remote farms. Homes are left unshuttered. Roofs collapse over time. Wells dry up. Olive trees are overtaken by thickets. The path into town fades. By the time tax collectors or church officials return, often years later, there's nothing left to administer. A 1351 report from the Diocese of Arles lists more than 20 parishes with no living priest or congregation. It simply notes, non potuit collegi decima, the tithe could not be collected. These were not burned ruins. There was no sack or siege. The villages weren't destroyed, they were simply forgotten. The monastic record keepers. Monasteries, often better organized and literate than secular lords, offer rare glimpses into this rural loss. In Montmajour Abbey, a Benedictine house near Arles, the monks kept precise inventories of rents owed by surrounding villages. In the years before the plague, the abbey collected dues in cheese, olives, poultry, and coin. But by 1350, the entries shift. Maleny empty. St. Pons, all tenants gone. Verquières, church intact but no offerings. The monks didn't always know why. They didn't visit every hamlet. They simply recorded absence. In some cases, they attempted to repopulate villages by offering favorable terms, 1 year rent-free for any family settling in St. Jérôme. But the offers often went unanswered. Where once had been life tools, children, animals, smoke from chimneys now stood only stone and silence. Environmental reclamation. As humans retreated, the land changed. Fields reverted to scrubland. Terraced vineyards collapsed. Wild boars and wolves reclaimed quiet pastures. In the absence of shepherds and boundaries, nature crept back in. Forests spread. Olive groves became indistinguishable from underbrush. Streams ran unbridged again. One chronicle from the 1370s, describing a journey between Arles and Apt, remarked, "We pass through hills once bright with village bells. Now only the wind greets us, and thorn brambles where fences once stood. And so, the very landscape began to forget the shape of human presence. The psychological toll. For those who remained, the emptiness was its own kind of burden. Imagine living in a nearby village, one that had survived, and walking past an empty hamlet you once traded with. Perhaps your aunt had married there. Perhaps you remember a festival, a dance, a feud over sheep. Now it is nothing, just roofless homes, a crumbling font, and rusted tools left where hands once worked them. This proximity to loss was unique to rural Provence. In cities, death came with noise, bells, carts, sermons. But in the countryside, death left quiet and rot. People began to whisper of ghosts. Some said certain hills were cursed, that drinking from abandoned wells brought illness. Memory decayed into myth. Resettlement attempts. Throughout the latter half of the 14th century, efforts were made to resettle abandoned villages. Some lords issued charters of privilege. Land at discounted rents, the right to pass holdings to children, tax exemptions for a number of years. But such efforts had mixed success. For one, survivors didn't want to return to villages associated with death. Others preferred the growing towns, where markets, protection, and religious services were more reliable. And in some cases, the geography worked against revival. Isolated villages no longer justified the cost of roads, mills, or churches. Some settlements were consolidated. 2 or 3 villages merged into one, leaving behind their original homes and sacred sites. By 1400, dozens, possibly hundreds of Provençal villages had simply ceased to exist, leaving only stone foundations and the occasional field name as evidence. The empty villages of Provence offer no great battles, no sweeping proclamations. Their story is not one of conquest or rebellion, but of erosion of memory, of presence, of meaning. They are a reminder that societies don't always fall with fire and sword. Sometimes, they simply stop being inhabited, and what was once a place becomes only a name on a brittle page or nothing at all. But one must wonder, if a village disappears and no one remembers it, does its history end or merely become invisible? In the decades after the Black Death, Provence became a land not only of survivors but of inheritors of silence. They lived beside ruins that once held laughter and livestock, beside chapels now roofless and overtaken by ivy. Their lives unfolded in the shadow of what had once been full. Unlike cities where the plague passed quickly and life resumed with noisy resilience, the Provençal countryside preserved its scars. Ruins stood untouched for decades. Names of lost villages lingered on maps long after no one lived there. In many cases, the only people who regularly passed through these places were tax collectors, monks, or shepherds, who noted what no longer was. And yet some returned, some repopulated, others resisted. This section explores the strange aftermath of rural abandonment, the administrative headaches, the legends that grew, and the slow redefinition of what it meant to belong to the land. The legal trouble with dead villages. A practical issue emerged almost immediately after the wave of abandonment: ownership. If an entire village vanished, tenants, clergy, even stewards who now held the rights to that land. The crown, the church, a distant noble family. One 1365 case involved the seigneury of Saint Cyprien, a modest village near Carpentras. The last surviving member of its peasant community had fled in 1350. When a nearby abbey tried to reclaim the fields in 1363, the Bishop of Venasque objected, presenting a tattered parchment listing rights from 1297. The dispute lasted 4 years. By the time it was resolved, the land was overgrown, and neither party found anyone willing to farm it. Such cases were common. Monasteries argued over rights to abandoned mills. Nobles tried to expand their holdings by absorbing ghost villages. Royal officers, sensing opportunity, often assigned land to loyalists. In many places, the only human activity around these villages came from the courthouse and the chancery. The rise of noble desertion. In some instances, it wasn't just peasants who fled. Even lower-tier nobles began abandoning their rural estates, especially those too isolated or too unproductive to justify rebuilding. The phenomenon became so common that it acquired a label in notarial records: noble desertion. These lords often moved into towns or cities, leasing their old fiefs for minimal fees or simply letting them lapse. One case from 1382 in Arles notes: "The lands of the Seigneur d'Aubigny are now tenantless. His manse stands roofless, his obligations unpaid. It is presumed he has taken residence in Avignon." This abandonment further disrupted the feudal model. With no lord present and no tenants left to till the land, the social architecture that had governed rural Provence collapsed like the houses themselves. In time, new arrangements would take root, but they would be very different from what had come before. New settlers, old land. To counteract abandonment, various authorities offered incentives to repopulate deserted areas. 1 to 3 years without rent. Free use of grazing lands. Exemption from certain taxes. Permission to form new communal charters. Some of these efforts were modestly successful. In Les Palades, a group of 8 families resettled around 1370 under terms negotiated with a Dominican prior. They were granted access to a shared well, use of nearby woodland, and protection under monastic law rather than noble. But these resettlements were rarely full restorations. Instead of rebuilding an entire village, new settlers clustered around the edge of the old site, using stone from abandoned homes to construct simpler dwellings. Fields were consolidated. Churches were not always repaired. Communal identity gave way to pragmatic survival. And often, the newcomers were not descendants of the original inhabitants. They bore different surnames, dialects, and customs. The land was the same, but the culture had shifted. In essence, the new Provence was built atop the husks of the old. The landscape of the lost. Over time, abandoned villages became part of the landscape's identity. They acquired nicknames like La Vieille Bourg, the old town; Les Ruins, the ruins; Les Crottes, the scraps; Mort de Fontaine, dead spring. These names passed into local lore, sometimes carried by shepherds or seasonal farmers, sometimes by the stories told to children about haunted wells or cursed groves. In some cases, physical markers remained: a stone cross with no base, a worn threshold still embedded in the earth, a collapsed oven beside a wild fig tree. No official record remained, no census, but people remembered at least for a while that there had once been a place there. A quiet anthropology emerged, oral, spatial, imprecise. And over generations, even those whispers faded, leaving behind only terrain. Resistance to return. While authorities hoped for resettlement, many survivors refused to return to plague-stricken sites. There were spiritual reasons: the idea that these villages had been punished, or that ghosts lingered in the fields. Even clergy were reluctant to reconsecrate old chapels. There were practical reasons: no protection, no infrastructure, no community. Why return to a place where one's kin had died, where the roof had caved in, and where wolves now sniffed the corners? 1379, account from a Provençal merchant reads: "I offered coin and land for any man to clear Saint Jerome. None came, not from the hills, not from the valley. They said the wind there speaks in tongues." These refusals slowed efforts to recover the pre-plague landscape. What emerged instead was a new geography, shaped by risk, memory, and necessity. Monastic farming and silent ownership. One group that did return, though cautiously, were the monastic orders, especially Benedictines and Cistercians. They didn't rebuild villages, but rather repurposed the land for grange farming. large, often enclosed farms operated by lay brothers or hired labor. Instead of a village of 25 families, a grange might house 6 to 8 workers living beside a central storehouse or press. In this way, land continued to produce even as villages were left to crumble. But these granges had no community, no parish, no festivals. They were economic units, not settlements. Monasteries prospered quietly. They kept records, managed yields, and avoided the messiness of resettlement politics. And as the world moved on, monks became the last chroniclers of the villages they had outlived. The long shadow into the 15th century. By 1400, the map of rural Provence had changed beyond recognition. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of villages remained abandoned. Others had been partially revived, but only in fragments. Some had merged with neighboring settlements, erasing original identities. Land had become concentrated in fewer hands: monasteries, cities, or ambitious rural notaries. The population remained well below its pre-plague peak, and with each passing decade, the memory of what had once stood faded further. In 1433, a papal land survey of Comtat Venaissin noted, "Some places no longer have names. We record them only as fields without walls." And so, in the span of less than a century, entire communities had gone from bustling life to whispered legend to nameless ground. The loss of the provincial villages was not merely demographic, it was existential. In their absence, a new kind of presence formed: fields farmed but unlived in, chapels remembered but unused, names half-spoken in the wind. What remained was not emptiness, but ghost infrastructure: legal claims without inhabitants, lands producing without community, stones bearing witness to voices long gone. And yet one cannot help but wonder, is it the land that forgets us, or are we the ones who forget the land? By the close of the 15th century, the great wave of abandonment that had swept through the provincial countryside had mostly stabilized. The plague, though still a recurring visitor, no longer struck with the same catastrophic mortality. New generations had been born, and the memory of the Black Death became more rumor than recollection. Yet even centuries later, the imprint of loss lingered. In the valleys and on the hillsides, you could still find a tilting stone wall, a church with no bell, a fig tree growing from a staircase that led nowhere. The abandoned villages of Provence had not returned, nor had they truly disappeared. Instead, they remained in a strange historical limbo, half remembered and wholly uninhabited. This final section explores the long-term echoes of these vanished places, how they were folded into maps and myths, how archaeologists rediscovered their outlines, and how silence itself became a kind of heritage. The plague returns, but the villages do not. Though the Black Death's initial impact between 1347 and 1352 had been the most intense, it was not the last chapter. Plague revisited Provence intermittently over the next 3 centuries, with outbreaks recorded in 1361, 1382, 1399, and well into the 17th century. However, these subsequent waves no longer triggered mass rural abandonment. Why? Because many of the villages most vulnerable had already been erased. The survivors had restructured their settlement patterns. Populations had consolidated in market towns, or in villages with walls, wells, and wider access to roads. The patchwork of provincial habitation had shifted from a fine embroidery to a coarser but more durable weave. The ghost villages, those that had once numbered in the hundreds, became archaeological footprints, nothing more. No bells rang for them, no records renewed their names. They became mute landmarks, referenced only when someone stumbled upon an old foundation or a carved stone cross in a sheep pasture. When ruins become resources. Centuries passed. By the 1600s, many forgotten villages were quarried for stone, their walls dismantled to pave roads, shore up new farmhouses, or build manorial estates. Locals often used the ruins like open-pit hardware stores, removing beams, tiles, even bricks of lime mortar. Others served new purposes. Old churches became animal shelters. Abandoned wells were reopened, cleaned, and reused. Flat areas once home to hamlets became vineyards or almond orchards. The land was too valuable to leave untouched forever, but the memory of the people who once lived there had vanished. When workers found bones or coins, they rarely kept them. They tossed them aside. No names were associated, no curses, just old, silent matter. Cartography and the resurrection of names. In the 18th and 19th centuries, French cartographers began to take a more methodical interest in the landscape. As they created detailed cadastral maps and geodetic surveys, they encountered toponyms, place names that no longer matched any inhabited site. Le Plan de Saint-Laurent, Les Aiguilles, El Austelit Via. Locals often shrugged when asked. Some knew faint legends of a chapel that once stood, of bones plowed up in the fields, but no one remembered who had lived there or when. Historians and archaeologists in the 19th century began compiling lists of villages disparus, disappeared villages. Using monastic records, feudal charters, and papal tithing rolls, they cross-referenced names with geographical features and redrew the invisible map of 14th century Provence. In many cases, these lost villages outnumbered the ones that had survived. It was a revelation. The countryside had once been far more densely populated and far more vulnerable than anyone living remembered. The archaeology of abandonment. In the 20th century, archaeologists began conducting systematic excavations at sites believed to be lost plague villages. They found hearths, sometimes still containing charred remains of meals never eaten. Coins dated to the early 1300s, never newer. Ceramic fragments, spindle whorls, iron sickles, and remnants of wall plaster. Stone foundations, laid out in grids matching medieval building codes. There were rarely signs of violent destruction. No burned layers, no siege artifacts. Instead, the pattern matched the historical record: sudden cessation of life, then slow, natural decay. Graves were sometimes found unmarked, shallow, and masked. DNA analysis confirmed plague in some cases. Others remained ambiguous. But more than physical evidence, these excavations unearthed a deeper truth: how ordinary and fragile village life had been. They were not grand cities or fortress towns. They were intimate, human-scale communities, with everything arranged around shared wells, ovens, and pastures. And when they fell silent, the world hardly noticed. A modern rediscovery of silence. In recent years, interest in lost villages has grown not just from academics, but from walkers, artists, and conservationists. Hiking trails across Provence now include placards that note Ruins de l'Ancien Hameau de la Bessade des Certés, vers 1350. Chapelle Saint-Véran-Zes, Village disparu. Some municipalities have restored these sites not to repopulate them, but to honor their emptiness. Stone benches have been added. Signs mark the outlines of long-gone houses. Wild herbs have been planted to reflect medieval diets. This isn't nostalgia. It's memorialization, a recognition that history includes what no longer stands. The silence of the empty villages has become its own kind of voice, one that whispers from underfoot, one that lingers in the gaps between vineyards and olive groves. What do we inherit from the lost? The abandoned villages of Provence leave behind no artifacts of grandeur, no palaces, no cathedrals. Their ruins are modest, their records thin, their stories fragmented at best. But their legacy is profound. They teach us about vulnerability. Even the most rooted communities can vanish in a single generation. Adaptation. The survivors reshape the land not through triumph but through necessity. Forgetting. Historical memory is a fragile thing. Without scribes, oral tradition, or continued presence, even entire villages can fade to dust. They also invite us to question: how do we define a place once it is uninhabited? What duties do we owe to forgotten lives? How much of our current landscape is built atop unmarked loss? And finally, they remind us that history is not just the record of what was, but also the echo of what ceased to be. End of story reflection. Today, you can walk through the hills of Provence and pass by an olive tree growing where a hearth once warmed a family. You can step over stones laid by hands whose names were never recorded. You can sit in silence and hear nothing but wind, yet feel the heavy presence of all that once was. The empty villages do not ask to be remembered, but they are there, in the soil and the roots, in the faint names on forgotten maps. They teach us a quiet truth. History is not just what survives, it is also what waits to be seen again. Story 6. The Healer's Burden, Medieval Medicine and the Plague. When you picture the Black Death, a certain figure might come to mind. A tall man in a long dark cloak, with a wide-brimmed hat and a long curved beak like a bird. This is the plague doctor, an image so iconic it borders on theatrical. But in the 14th century, he wasn't a symbol. He was a desperate human being, called to do the impossible, to heal the incurable, or at the very least to not die trying. This section is not about the dramatized version of medicine. It is about what medicine actually looked like in the years surrounding the plague, what healers believed, what they did, what they feared, and how they tried to stay alive while treating the dying. Their tools were rudimentary, their theories were ancient, and their success rates tragically low, but they labored on nonetheless. This is the story of how medieval medicine met its greatest trial, and how the healers themselves became patients, historians, and sometimes victims of their own remedies. The medical landscape before the plague. Before the plague arrived in 1347, European medicine was largely grounded in Galenic theory. The Roman physician Galen, 2nd century CE, had outlined a system of health based on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Illness, according to Galen, was caused by an imbalance of these humors, often influenced by one's environment, diet, or emotional state. Treatment involved restoring balance through bleeding, purging, or changing the patient's environment. Doctors also adhered to the theory of miasma, the belief that bad air, often from swamps or decaying matter, caused disease. This would later influence the design of the plague doctor's costume. Medical knowledge circulated in handwritten manuscripts, often preserved in monasteries or university towns like Montpellier or Bologna. Formal physicians were typically educated in Latin, familiar with ancient texts, and often more philosophers than practitioners. The actual work of healing, however, fell to a broader caste. Barber surgeons, who performed bloodletting and amputations. Wise women, who administered herbs and poultices. Apothecaries, who prepared remedies from plants, minerals, and animal parts. Monks and nuns, who treated the sick in monastic infirmaries. There were also charlatans, mystics, and alchemists, who offered amulets or potions of dubious effectiveness. By 1347, this ecosystem of belief and practice was not built for a world-ending disease, and yet it was all they had. The plague arrives, a medical crisis unfolds. When the Black Death began its spread, it defied explanation. The symptoms were grotesque and swift. Buboes large, swollen lymph nodes that turned black. High fever and delirium. Vomiting of blood. Death often within 2-3 days. Nothing in the classical texts explained this horror. Some healers blamed planetary alignments. Others accused sin, divine punishment, or poisoning. A few linked the disease to corrupted air, affirming the miasma theory. but no one could treat it with consistency, and many doctors died simply by examining patients. The physical examination, the hallmark of modern medicine, was now a death sentence. Still, some physicians tried. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI's personal doctors worked tirelessly and left behind some of the earliest plague treatises. One such physician, Guy de Chauliac, wrote, "The swellings often appear in the armpits and groin, and death follows within 3 days. I remained, though most fled. Few returned." He himself caught the plague and survived barely. The role of the plague doctor. By the late 14th century, cities began to hire official plague doctors, not always licensed physicians, but individuals willing to treat victims when others refused. They were paid by municipalities, not patients, and were often young, inexperienced, or desperate. The now famous plague doctor costume emerged later, likely in the 17th century, but its roots lie in these early experiments with protective gear. Descriptions suggest that even in the 1300s, doctors began soaking clothing in vinegar or camphor oil, stuffing masks or scarves with strong-smelling herbs, rosemary, lavender, or wormwood, carrying pomander spheres filled with spices to ward off bad air, avoiding skin contact at all costs. The logic was flawed, but the behavior was proto-hygienic. Avoiding contact, creating distance, masking smell, these were accidental precursors to germ theory centuries away. Yet being a plague doctor was rarely noble. Most were viewed with suspicion or pity, especially when they failed to save lives. Their presence often meant one thing: you were already too late. Treatments, from helpful to harmful. Desperate for cures, healers tried anything and everything. Bloodletting, believed to rebalance the humors, it likely weakened patients further. Boil lancing, some tried draining buboes with knives or glass. It occasionally relieved pressure, but often caused infection or spread. Herbal concoctions, sage, rue, marigold, and garlic were common. Some had mild antibacterial properties. Fumigations, burning aromatic woods or herbs in rooms, sometimes along with sulfur or mercury. Dietary changes, patients were advised to avoid fruits, wine, or cold food. Some regimes required abstaining from bathing. Religious remedies, pilgrimage, prayer, or self-flagellation. In some towns, flagellant groups whipped themselves in public to atone for collective sin. Toads and crushed gemstones, applied to skin as drawers of poison. Ineffective but popular among wealthier patients. Healers had no real standard. What worked for one might fail for the next, and when their patients died, as most did, so did their reputations. Healers turned historians. Some doctors, knowing they could not cure the plague, became witnesses instead. They chronicled symptoms, survival patterns, and regional variations. They documented environmental conditions and proposed theories, sometimes wildly speculative, sometimes eerily accurate. One Florentine physician wrote, "The disease spares none, yet in higher places it seems slower. Let us examine whether winds from the south carry more death." This rudimentary epidemiology would become the foundation for future understandings of plague transmission. They also wrote about the emotional toll, the fear of touching a dying child, the loneliness of being the last person willing to enter a house, the burden of being blamed for the inevitable. Some records read like confessionals, others like scientific observations. In trying to heal, they also tried to record what went wrong, hoping future generations might learn. The price of care. Doctors and healers faced enormous risk, not just of infection, but of social ostracization, financial ruin, and moral despair. Those who stayed and failed were condemned. Those who fled were accused of cowardice. Many had no families left by the end. And yet some endured. The Benedictine nun sister Agnes of Montmajour wrote of tending to the sick for 4 months, using wine-soaked cloth and ash from burned herbs to cleanse wounds. She lost her entire convent. She alone survived. A Jewish healer in Narbonne, Isaac ben Elias, recorded treating plague victims with rose oil and vinegar. When they died, he was accused of witchcraft and forced into exile. Their stories rarely make it into textbooks, yet without them, we might not know the texture of suffering in the 14th century. They were not miracle workers. They were ordinary people with extraordinary burdens. To treat the plague in the Middle Ages was to confront an invisible killer with blindfolded eyes and trembling hands. These healers lacked microscopes, vaccines, or even soap. And yet, many stepped forward. They did not always succeed. Most did not. But their efforts gave form to fear and sometimes even comfort to the dying. And so we ask, in a world without hope of cure, what is the value of trying? When we speak of healers during the Black Death, we often imagine physicians trained in the scholastic universities of Montpellier, Paris, or Bologna. But in reality, most Europeans during the 14th century never saw a physician. Instead, the burden of care fell to a diverse and deeply local collection of people: apothecaries, midwives, monks, nuns, herbalists, and family caregivers. This section steps away from the plague doctor and enters the less formal world of grassroots medicine, the herbal gardens of convents, the smoky workshops of apothecaries, and the hands of women delivering bobbies while trying to keep death at bay. These were not fringe actors. They were the medical system for most people, and in a world undone by plague, they tried often in silence to do what they could with what little they had. Apothecaries, chemists before chemistry. In every major town and many smaller ones, apothecaries provided access to medical substances. They were not doctors, but specialists in materia medica, the ingredients used to treat illness. Their shops were sensory experiences. Shelves of dried herbs: lavender, sage, thyme, rue. Vials of colored powders: saffron, cinnabar, powdered pearls. Mortars for grinding, alembics for distilling, and copper scales for weighing precise doses. An apothecary's toolkit might include hundreds of substances, ranging from harmless to highly toxic. Mandrake root, for example, was used as an anesthetic, but too much could cause hallucinations or coma. During plague years, demand soared for theriac, a complex antidote originally designed for snake bites, believed to help with all poisons. Vinegar of the Four Thieves, a blend of garlic, rosemary, sage, and vinegar, rumored to protect grave robbers from infection. Unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, fantastical but wildly popular among the rich. Apothecaries also had to interpret astrological charts, mix remedies according to moon phases, and navigate both scientific and superstitious knowledge. They were equal parts pharmacist, herbalist, and alchemist. The cloistered healers, monks and nuns in the age of pestilence. Monasteries and convents had long served as centers of healing. Their infirmaries, often modest, were grounded in routine, observation, and prayer. The rule of Saint Benedict advised care for the sick as a form of divine service, and many monastic communities maintained herbal gardens, copied medical texts, and trained brothers or sisters in the care of the ill. In plague years, these sanctuaries became overwhelmed. Benedictine nuns in Marseille reportedly cared for over 300 plague victims in a single month. Monks in Avignon reopened an abandoned leper hospital to isolate the infected. Sisters in Toulouse went from room to room with vinegar-soaked cloths, tending to the dying while chanting psalms. They also died in staggering numbers. In some orders, 2/3 of members were lost during a single wave. Still, their records became invaluable. Their letters, logs, and recipe books preserved not only treatments but the rhythms of crisis, how communities adapted, how burial practices changed, how compassion endured. One abbess wrote simply, "We wash their bodies with rosemary and wine. We pray, some live, most do not, but none die alone." Midwives and women's knowledge. Much of medieval healing happened in kitchens, gardens, and birthrooms, places where women held authority. Midwives were especially vital. They not only delivered babies but often served as caregivers to the sick, providers of herbal remedies, sources of community health advice, spiritual guides during illness. Their knowledge was oral, passed down through apprenticeship, not books. They used comfrey for wounds, pennyroyal for fevers, mugwort for labor pains, and dozens of other remedies based on seasonal availability. During plague years, midwives often treated whole families, offering comfort, food, and medicinal teas when no one else would approach the house. But their power came with danger. In times of panic, suspicion turned toward women with healing skills. They were accused of witchcraft, blamed for plague outbreaks, or driven from towns. Some were even executed, though less during the Black Death itself, and more during later plagues of the 16th and 17th centuries. Nonetheless, their role remained crucial and unrecorded, tucked into the folds of daily survival. Healing the poor and the marginalized. For the vast majority of peasants, medical care came from neighbors, kin, and religious charities. There were no hospitals in most villages, and when there were, access was limited. The wealthy had private physicians, the poor had hope and folk wisdom. Some key elements of peasant healing included kitchen medicine, onion poultices, honey dressings, vinegar compresses. Saints, relics, touching cloths to reliquaries of plague-protecting saints like St. Sebastian or St. Roch. Public fountains, believed to have healing properties if blessed or sourced from sacred springs. Community fasting and processions, attempts to appease divine wrath. The poor buried their own. They nursed each other. They prayed together. And when death came, they dug shallow graves and tried again the next day. Jews, Muslims, and medical diversity. In southern France and Iberia, where Jewish and Muslim communities still persisted before their later expulsions, alternative medical traditions enriched and complicated the healing landscape. Jewish physicians, often trained in both Hebrew and Latin texts, served in towns like Narbonne and Arles. They brought perspectives from Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was a leading text across Europe and the Middle East. Maimonides, who emphasized hygiene, nutrition, and mental health. Sephardic herbalism, with a wide catalog of medicinal plants and roots. Muslim medical traditions, especially in Andalusia, also emphasized public health, quarantines, and hospital hygiene ideas that would slowly spread into Christian Europe. However, during plague years, Jewish communities were often scapegoated. Accused of poisoning wells or summoning the disease, many were killed or driven out. Their healers disappeared along with them. The irony is painful. Some of the most advanced medical thinkers of the age were silenced in the very moment their knowledge might have helped most. Recipes, remains, and legacy. What remains of these healers today? Herbals, illustrated manuscripts detailing plants and their uses, often annotated by nuns or village clerics. Medical talismans, inscribed amulets once worn by apothecaries or caregivers. Plague treatises, written by practitioners across the social spectrum, including monks and midwives. Archaeological finds, jars of remedies, tools for lancing, even small shrines in abandoned homes. Together, they paint a picture of plurality, healing as a tapestry of belief, trial, error, and desperate care. No one method worked, but together they formed a cultural response to unimaginable suffering. Behind every known healer was an unknown multitude, quiet hands preparing herbs, voices singing over beds, fingers bandaging sores with no hope of reward. They did not wear beaked masks. They did not sign charters, but they were the ones who stayed behind when others fled. They remind us that healing is not always about curing. Sometimes it is about presence, about touch, about doing what you can with what you have. So we must ask, in the face of despair, is there a difference between healing and hope?